Bon, en tout cas, j'introduis la table ronde. De toute façon, vous avez le sujet. L'idée, c'est on va parler pendant 1 heure des impacts des énergies renouvelables sur la biodiversité et comment les réduire au maximum, notamment en s'inspirant des exemples de parcs naturels régionaux et d'aires protégées. Alors bien sûr, il y a beaucoup d'autres facteurs qui impactent la biodiversité et sûrement de manière beaucoup plus importante que les énergies renouvelables. Mais voilà, les installateurs d'éoliennes, de centrales solaires, ils essayent de faire de leur mieux pour réduire ces impacts. On va voir comment et on va s'inspirer des exemples dans les parcs naturels régionaux. Et pour cela, on a la chance d'avoir 4 experts de ce sujet. Donc, j'appelle à cette table ronde Robin Dixon pour France Renouvelable, Thomas EGLIN pour l'ADEME, Philippe Moutet pour la Fédération des Parcs naturels régionaux et Bertrand Schatz, directeur de recherche au CNRS. Un représentant
So we're lucky enough to have a representative from the world of sciences, one from the natural regional parks, one from renewable energy operators, and a representative from the Agency for Ecological Transition under the umbrella of the state. So we have a right panel here, I think. I'm going to sit here.
Non, mais très bien, mettez-vous comme ça. Et, voilà. Vous serez plus à l'aise. Alors, tout le monde a son casque, c'est parfait. Il y a aussi une traduction.
There is also translation available in English, and there will be 5 minutes of question Q&A. If you have any questions to ask in English, it will be translated into French.
Alors, nous allons commencer
so we're going to begin
cette table ronde
this round table
avec Philippe Moutet pour les parcs naturels régionaux. Comprendre qu'est-ce que c'est que les parcs naturels
what are these regional natural parks? Could you please tell us about them in a few words? And also talk to us about the parks charters, which is one of the tools that allow the integration of renewable energies within these parks. So I will more specifically introduce Philippe Moutet. You're in charge of energy, climate, adaptation, carbon and architecture for the Federation of Regional Natural Parks in France.
On peut avoir la première slide, s'il vous plaît. Alors, attendez, je vais vous la mettre. Voilà.
Bonjour à tous. Alors,
so good afternoon, everybody. I won't have any slides. I've been quite sober. You will just have the map of the parks. That just allows you to see the 59 regional natural parks that represent 18 to 19% of France, and which are protected areas in the sense of the IUCN with different protective scopes. So the question of energy within the scope of renewable energies is strongly present in the park since 2000, since the first directives were issued on wind turbines. And this is a mission that is really important for us because today renewable energies are present in all of the regional natural parks with different types and setups. And since 2000, all of the parks of the Federation have adopted a position on these different energies.
Documents d'orientation que vous avez évoqués, la charte de parc notamment,
and in particular the park charters, they have established a strategy for the park around energy. So quite concretely what we must retain from this is that it is a reality, although we're protected areas. And of course we don't want all renewable energies in the protected areas. We are in a protected area and we want it to remain protected. But it is a fact of life that we have to manage. I talked about types. We have all types of renewable energies. So very quickly, the Federation, like the parks, must adopt a position. At the level of the Federation, we have national positions on photovoltaics in all of its form, on methanization, wind turbines, biomass, etc. So the relationship between that subject and the parks is very strong, but which doesn't mean that we want to have all of the renewable energies in our parks. But what we want is that if there must be a project within the scope of the park, the developers and the state or regional services that support these projects take into account the work carried out by our parks through the Charter, where we have specific challenges and we also have directives that can be used by the developers around the challenges of biodiversity, landscape and the economic routing in the territory. And if we manage to achieve this, it allows the developer either to change their projects or it develop it in a coherent way. And rather than becoming a handicap, it can be an asset to take into account the recommendations of a territory, including regarding the landscape, which I didn't mention. The question of biodiversity is particularly important for us because the landscape is the first reflex we have normally in the regional parks, and most of the reactions are for or against through the landscape impact. But biodiversity is a very important subject also, which we must work on. And this is also why we are engaged in a European programme around the relationship between biodiversity and renewable energies. Yes, indeed, we will be talking about that, and these charters are documents. Yeah, the park charter, it's based on consultation. We don't have any additional coercive power with regard to the authorities that manage us, and it is an original project that was created in 1967, which is based on consultation and co-construction with all territorial stakeholders. So the charter lasts for 15 years, which doesn't correspond to the electoral time. It's a long project, and it's a reasonable scale for a territory. And above all, the charter is subject to public inquiry. It is presented, and it's a document that is not constructed in an isolated manner, but it's the fruit of discussion exchange throughout the region. And this is what gives the document its value. Thank you very much. I would like to pass the floor to Thomas EGLIN. Thomas EGLIN, you are coordinator of the Soil, Landscape, Environmental Impacts and Renewable Energy Centre in the ADEME, the Agency for Ecological Transition. Thomas EGLIN, could you talk to us about the Observatory of Renewable Energies and Biodiversity? Because I think that the ADEME is leading actions with the regional and natural parks, maybe within the scope of this observatory. But could you explain the object of this observatory? Because it was created this year under the umbrella of the ADEME and the French Office of Biodiversity. And what relationship do you have with the regional parks and the link with renewable energies, of course?
Ouais, bonjour à tous.
So good afternoon, everybody.
Donc, juste pour repositionner aussi
so just to reposition the action of ADEME around renewable energies, you are familiar with our support for projects and renewable heat or methanization, and our expertise in wind turbines and electricity sectors. But we also develop networks of consultants within our territory. And in recent years, there is a number of subjects that have been of increasing interest, and in particular the integration within the territories of renewable energies and how we deal with take into account biodiversity, how we take into account the question of landscapes, and also the questions of soil artificialization, which are subjects that are intrinsic to these sectors. So we've developed a certain number of partnerships, and this has come to life recently with the implementation of the Observatory of Renewable Energies Biodiversity, and I would add soils and landscapes, because it is part of the mission of the observatory, which was created by the Law of Acceleration of the Production of Renewable Energies in 2023, and the decree that establishes the mission of the observatory was published in April 2024. So, also, this observatory has the interest of bringing together two alliances, because we're not competent in biodiversity. We're the agency for the energy transition, but we don't have a mission of biodiversity. So we work with the French Office of Biodiversity, and the idea of this observatory is to bring objective knowledge to all of the stakeholders on the impacts that renewable energy projects can have, and on the question of mitigation. So we have three axes in this observatory. The first one is looking at the state-of-the-art of knowledges and impacts. So we must develop scientific knowledge and to objectivize the impacts, because it's very difficult to evaluate the impacts and mitigation solutions. And then on the data collected by developers, we must also see how we can build upon this data, which is collected at a large scale across all of the projects. So that's the first axis, that's the initial mission of the observatory, but that is not enough. Because once we have this knowledge, then we must also have the tools for transfer.
on voit des impacts.
Because we see impacts, we see the effectiveness of measures, but how do we actually, take them on board in the territory? So this brings us to the third axis, which is that of transfer, which is the National Resource Centre, which will be established within the OFB, the French Office of Biodiversity, with 3 subjects, setting up a website. So there is a draft website, but that will be improved shortly to make available all of the scientific literature, the educational guides, and there is a LinkedIn that is being set up, and some people already subscribed. We have 1,000 followers, but we need to sign up more people. So the idea is to develop technical guides, involve stakeholders, scientists, engineering offices, developers in the drawing up of technical guides in order to improve projects. And a third point, which is important, and this makes a link with Philip, we also think that we need a place for debate. So there is a direction that we want to develop an agora with seminars and discussions to talk about these technical guides and knowledge and how they should be taken on board and develop feedback on experience. And this is where our partnership with the regional natural parks has its fully fledged place, because Philip, you can add to this, but within the framework of the project funded by Europe, the idea is to bring together the protected areas in order to feed back the questions that are raised in terms of the development of renewable energies within the territories, how they take them on board and what they need, and where they identify best practices. Well, that's perfect, because we were talking later on about the first feedback of the LIFE program that you're talking about. I would now like to hear Bertrand Chat. You are Director of Research in the CNRS. You're a specialist in pollinization. I think you also manage a research team on this theme, and you're a member of the CNPN, the National Council for the Protection of Nature, which gives its opinion on a lot of projects, and in particular projects of renewable energies.
Est-ce que je dis que vous avez fait beaucoup parler de vous,
you've made quite a buzz with the fact that you're working on the deployment of photovoltaics and its impact on biodiversity, which is a subject of much debate and has created quite a buzz within the world of renewable energies. So, Mr. Chat, can you talk to us about the main cause of decline of biodiversity in the world, in France, and, where do renewable energies come in to all of this? Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, the causes of the decline of biodiversity, above all, the degradation and destruction of the natural habitats. Everything linked to human activity, climate change, pollution, invasive species, exotic species. There are lots of relationships with farming, in particular in Europe, for example, around the question of pesticides, which have a strong impact on biodiversity at different scales. And in this rather negative landscape, renewable energies are an additional cause. For example, we talk about the need to deploy 100,000, 150,000 hectares in France. But for the time being, there aren't many solutions for certain taxonomic groups. I'm thinking of soil, about pollinators. There are few solutions, so it's an additional cause of degradation of the habitat. It's 150,000 hectares. Is it all renewable energies? Oh, no, photovoltaics in particular. Okay.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Romain Dixon, you are project manager for the environment and planning for France Renewable. Previously, France Éolienne. And this association promotes and defends electric renewable energies in France.
Robin
Dixon, can you tell us what we know about the impact of wind turbines and solar farms on biodiversity?
Oui, alors peut-être pour commencer déjà
maybe to begin on why do we do renewable energies, not just for the pleasure of it. Today, our need is to achieve carbon neutrality as fast as possible, and this requires an energy transition, sobriety, efficiency, so that focuses mainly on uses, and the production of low-carbon electricity, be it renewable or nuclear, with different times of deployment depending on that energy. In high proportions, in order to replace an energy mix, which today in France is 2/3 carbon-based. So 2/3 come from oil, gas, etc. So these fossil fuels. So we need, by 2035, to develop renewables. So for 2035, we must multiply by 5 the installed capacity. So today we're at 20 gigawatts, or last year at 20 gigawatts. So we must achieve between 75 and 100 by 2035. For land wind turbines, we're about 2022. 24 and a half now. Now, I separate offshore and land turbines, but then we must multiply things by 2 for land wind turbines, and for the offshore it's time 12, but the planning is different there. So we have significant needs of deployment of renewable energies, and above all, trajectories that must be maintained for and often speeded up in order to achieve our objectives to become carbon neutral. So what do we know of the impacts today? So for wind turbines, the impacts are mainly on flying wildlife, with a risk of a barrier effect, which is closely related to where we build the wind farms and the configuration of the farms. And the second point is the risk of collision with flying wildlife, which is also related to where it is built and the measures that are implemented on the wind turbines. And so, meaning also the shutdown of the wind turbines during high activity periods. And so it's either static, it's planned ahead of time, or it's dynamic with on-the-spot systems. And for PV, the main effects are the effects of shadow or shade on plants, the effect of permeability due to the creation of fences for non-agri PV projects to let the wildlife through, and then the fact of the land occupation. So all of these effects are highly dependent, once again, on where we build the site and how we set up the unit. So the type of panels chosen, the interrow between the different rows of panels, the height of the panels, everything that can allow more light to reach the soil is favorable. So we study all of this very closely. And in all, at the moment, we've counted 70 research programs on renewable energies and biodiversity. It's a lot. It's a lot more than a few years ago. There's been a real gain of interest recently, but in particular because the ADEME is a significant driving force of this. And the effect on biodiversity must be measured for the entire project, and not just the gross impact that we've just mentioned, but also what a renewable energy project allows in terms of funding additional measures. We might talk about that later, the measures that can be taken. Yes, and a final point on improving the knowledge of impacts and solutions. This is a main lever today. And we need a few key figures. The renewable energies and solar and wind energies spend 50 million euros on the impact on biodiversity. That would be a good thing, and we wouldn't have that money without renewable energies. It's more than 2,000 jobs around biodiversity, and it's the first contributor in terms of public data on biodiversity.
Alors, j'aimerais bien, mais
Thank you very much. Well,
donc, je vais passer la parole à
Philippe Moutet pour
les parcs naturels régionaux, mais ensuite je serais intéressée d'entendre quand même, mais plus tard, Bertrand Schatz, tout ce qui vient d'être dit, parce que j'imagine, en tant que scientifique, qui suivez de près toutes ces questions, vous avez aussi votre avis. Mais avant, on va entendre Philippe Moutet sur la Fédération des parcs naturels régionaux. Can you give us some examples de PNR, de chartes qui intègrent bien les énergies renouvelables,
include
qui essayent de
renewable energies that seek to protect wildlife.
Retour d'expérience.
So some feedback on experiences. So if I may, a quick reaction. So 50 million for research is important. And we say it's thanks to renewable energies, but as it's 15 million that will be given to the impact of renewable energies. If there weren't renewable energies, we wouldn't need 50 million to do the research. So, of course, I'm being a bit cheeky there, but it's not an additional flow. I would like to say we need research and beyond renewable energies in the parks, and this just raised the question, and Bertrand knows this more than I, of the means that are given to research to carry out these studies. Be it on the side of developers, the territories, or the ADEME, we also need to have research that is able to provide answers. And also, we carry out research over a long period of time because the impact that we're measuring are lengthy. And the time of research and the time of technical deployment is not the same. And often, the projects, it's not the fault of the developers at all, but the time of research is slower. And earlier on, we were talking about reactions in the park. For example, today, the big news is agrivoltaics for the coming years. It's very difficult to have some hindsight on this question. And a point that remains in suspense is that this year we've started implementing floating solar farms. And in our position, it was very difficult to establish some scientific elements because we had no feedback on this. So I think we must recall that in the interest of everybody here around the table, the means for research seem to me to be important. And it's not just to be kind to my neighbour, but we need it. And I think just as much as the developers, not only the territories. So to come back to the examples of parks, renewable energies, as I was saying earlier on, came along in about 2000, mostly with wind turbines and a rather radical approach at the time because it was the beginning. And for the parks, we were not, we had no opportunity, like all of the territories, to raise the question of renewable energies. So we tried to solve the questions as we go along. And very quickly we had to react and put together our ideas. So we thought, well, we'll look at the challenges of parks in terms of landscape, biodiversity, economic development, and an important point is also agriculture. It can disrupt the agricultural model, and that's an important topic. And we said we will publish documents which target the towns and developers to tell them how a project can be developed. I will take the example of the Cap-et-Marie d'Opale Park, which is in the most northern park of France. It's on Boulogne-sur-Mer. And very early on, they sought up a wind turbine framework, and it was 2012. It wasn't yesterday morning, where they compared the regulatory obligations that developers are familiar with, and they compared it also with the non-regulatory challenges, but which in terms of landscape and biodiversity really forged the identity of the territory. And these documents were made available to all of the developers of the towns, also the local authorities. The developers are rarely alone. Yes, but did they use it? Well, yes, they did use it. And what's interesting is that it was also used outside of the park, because in the park we have a mission of transfer and experimentation. So there are other towns that, which are outside of the scope of the park, but they used it. But in real life, it's not Disneyland. There are also developers who don't use it, and there are towns that don't take it into account. So we're in the real world here. Another example which is of interest is the natural regional park of the Narbonnaise in the Mediterranean. And this was created with existing wind turbines. It was the first park that had wind turbines in it when it was created. And so that meant that there was not necessarily antinomy between the presence of renewables and the creation of a park. Nevertheless, this park has published a guide and a renewable energy charter which targets developers, which provides them with a framework to be coherent with the park's recommendations. And the main message that we pass on to all of the parks is, in developers' projects, if you're not in a park, you won't tell you off, but you need to, if you're in a park, you have to contact the park very upstream, because we will give you some elements which facilitate your work and which will avoid you from developing a project that will run into trouble. And very often when the projects, you see the projects, they are so elaborated on side of the developers that the room for manoeuvre is quite low. So there are existing documents, and in all of the regional natural parks, you have different positions. So in the Narbonnaise Park, the developers followed the framework of the charter. Well, they were already pre-existing, but they did follow it. And now we're in a crucial phase for wind turbines, because we're on a phase of repowering. And this phase changes the sizings of the wind turbine. And in Languedoc, we set up a wind turbine management. There are 300 masts, and all of the calculations were based on 115 meters high. Now, today, the repowering questions all this, and it is conjuring up appetites and hostility. And the park must start its work again. Repowering in Melbourne is also the opportunity to correct the effects of the existing turbines. So we might not have measured effects on biodiversity in the past, and repowering and a negotiation with the park can be the opportunity of moving or modifying certain elements so that biodiversity is taken into account. So a lot of tools are available, and you must use them as developers, and you must read them before you start developing if possible. And as I say, if I put myself in an economic model, it's always good to have elements on where you will be working. And an element is the correlation with the local product, which is an important element for developers, and also the energy mix that the park offers, because the mix was built with the inhabitants. And I think that's also a favourable element for the developers to succeed in a project. So Thomas was talking about the LIFE programme earlier on. You are one of the components of the LIFE programme on biodiversity and protected areas. Yes, it started in July. So to give you the conclusions of a programme would be rather suspicious if we already had the results. Yes, so you have funding to work on the impact of renewables in protected areas. Yes, so as a park, we said that the subject of biodiversity must be highlighted because we talk a lot about landscapes and tools. So without coming back to the creation of the project, so before July, we launched a survey among all protected areas, from natural reserves to national parks, at the European level also, and we had practically 140 answers. And what was the trend? Well, they're currently being analysed because the survey is very rich, but we do have a small extract that I can deliver, so I can give you the ranking of the most present renewables. First of all, PV in all of its forms, and before the arrival of agrivoltaism. So I think that soil is first, and then there's roofing, and agrivoltaics comes along afterwards. Wind turbines are second. Then there's biomass. And last, mechanisation. It's not necessarily representative. What did they answer you about the role of developers? So the requests were quite strong. So first of all, for more than half, there was no or very little contact with developers when the projects might impact or be created in protected areas. So a developer's project which is outside of the protected area can still impact the protected area. Because if you put the wind turbine on the outskirts of a protected area, it will have impact on the wildlife. So there's a little contact. So there's a general dissatisfaction on the analysis of biodiversity measures that we asked for in renewable projects of all kinds. But there's a real desire to learn more. And the final point of this programme, we haven't talked about it so far, but which is important, including within the scope of national works with the ADEME and EFB, is that in the national parks, we also look at energy transport. So we work with Energies, RTE, GDR gas, etc., because the production infrastructure must inject into the grid. And there are challenges of biodiversity, and I think that which is neglected, I must say. And with the ADEME, we're supporting them on working on soils and renewables. So that is to summarize what we're doing.
Alors maintenant, écoutez, on va passer la parole aux opérateurs, représentés par Robin Dixon pour France Renewable. Donc apparemment, il y a une partie,
apparently there's a number, maybe half of protected areas have answered the survey, which is 130 out of thousands. And they think that we don't have a lot of contact with different operators prior to this work to come in. How are the operators and developers working with the RNPs? Protected areas. Do you have feedback on this from your experience? It means that part of them are in contact. It's not 100%. So I would like to add to what Philip said on good practices in protected zones and protected areas. They go beyond these practices, which are good for all projects. The consultation taking place as early as possible. The implication of elected officials in projects. These are good practices that at France Renewables we promote that with our partners, it's something that we really highlight and insist upon, is giving added value, regular added value, our elected officials on these synergistic, virtuous projects. And when there are charters for the RNP, this is the first document that must be consulted when there's a desire to create a project at a certain place. Maybe give an example, a project that will be a booklet we're going to publish Friday. We're going to publish 2 booklets on the links between biodiversity and PV, solar, and diversity. This particular example is not in a national regional park, it's in a natural zone, which is being protected by biotope. It's a PV central, land PV central, which is in our previous aerodrome that was in a classified area after that. It became classified, and they had major efforts were made to implant 30 hectares of PV solar panels only on what used to be landing areas for the planes. We restored the habitats, the dry fields between huge agricultural fields. So the arid area in the middle is like an oasis between these totally empty fields. So we restored these areas for these dry grasses. And then we followed up on flora and fauna that we're going to continue to follow up on for 30 years with this cycle. So this site is a protected site, and all of this has been done directly with the site manager, which is from Champagne-Ardenne, the conservatory to protect it, and we've been contacted since 2011, and that's an associate of this project. So I'll come back to the booklet so that we can talk about it more, but this is a clear example of what needs to be done. Discuss things together, think about the project with the site manager, and beyond that, create good practices in these protected areas, because they're not fundamentally different. They're not necessarily different in our projects, meaning reducing impacts following the project, creating the project in a way that it has less impact, whether that be for the PV farms, where we put the solar panels, at what height. For wind turbines, the important measures are to create the OPRA program, which was financed by the ADEME, that shows that for the turbine, when it's well implanted, their operators that worked on it well with their clamping apparatus, and that really helps the natural milieu when the flange system is well overseen. And that's in general when we're looking at the behavior of bats, for example. Of course, it's not just applied to these particular areas, but these can be applied to other things. When we talk about bridage, we're talking about when we're stopping the wind turbine and they're stopped. So when bats are in the highest level activities, or the high temperatures, the strength of the wind, etc., this is when we have to stop the wind turbines and stop the flange system. And these are good practices that we put in place.
Et j'en étais sur le bridage, pardon.
So I'm going to come back to the stopping of the PV, of the wind turbines in certain periods. And then, of course, we need to accompany people. We need to put that in place. And that goes sometimes really far or beyond the impact of the park in order to finance future actions to renew habitats. And again, I'd ask you to look at the booklets, because there's about 15 different examples, whether that be wind turbine or PV, and that are clear practices of parks, wind turbine parks or PV parks, PV farms. And we're not saying that everyone's doing it perfectly. Mistakes have been made. We're not at Disneyland, like Philippe said. We have made mistakes, but what we promise is good practices, those that you can find in these leaflets. We defend those good practices, and we hope that they're put in place as broadly as possible. We can see that innovation, we can walk around here at this conference today, and a lot of people are communicating about the actions they're putting in place for biodiversity, for pollinators in these parks, and this great added value, strong added value for these national regional parks. All these systems for detection, a lot of people here at the forum are here. There's a system that detects birds. We identify them and we stop the wind turbines in order to optimize and improve the production of biodiversity as based as the loss that it could be caused as compared to the production of electricity. This is going very, very quickly, and I've seen it in the last 3 years where this has been completely transformed, which is a great thing because we're continuing to improve on that. And to improve our knowledge, I'm just going to give a little advertising here. In Montpellier next year, we're organizing an international event on biodiversity and wind turbines. This is the 8th edition. It's a worldwide conference that lasts for 1 week, where all of the researchers from around the world come to speak about the impacts and solutions to the issues of biodiversity in wind turbine farms. So this is an event that really could interest a lot of people. It's the 12th of September in Montpellier, just to show you that we're continuing work. We have an impact, we're aware of it, but there are also ways that we can oversee it, to manage it, and have good practice, and we're going to continue to broadcast then, and we're looking to improve upon that. I can see that Bertrand Chasse, who's the Director of Research at CNRS, which is specialized in pollinators, he's been moving around on his chair as he hears all of this, so I'd like to hear what he has to say. What do you think about the measures taken by the developers to limit the impact of renewable energy installations on biodiversity? Should everything be thrown away, or are they doing things well?
Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
Ce que j'en pense, c'est que les panneaux actuels.
I think that the current solar panels that have strongly impacted biodiversity, I know that we recognize that this impact has taken place, and that's a good thing. The impact for pollinators was minus 46%, 15% under these panels. So now we're talking about wind turbines. The impacts on bats is enormous, on the birds it's enormous. So I understand that people are becoming more aware, and I know that we want to improve upon this, but we're not there yet. When we're referring to, we're talking about tension, we're talking about pesticides, we're talking about climate warming, climate change. What are you talking about? Is it acceptable? When we're talking about sovereignty, being independent on our food resources, they are species directly affected by this. These impacts are very important. A few words on the CNPN. I don't know if that's a bad word, a taboo word to say here, but we are trying to have the law be respected. That's all we want to do in terms of researching solutions that have the least amount of environmental impact. So the research of where you want to put this, I know this is a real big issue for developers. And once these solutions that has the least impact has been chosen, there's a sequence which is avoid, reduce, compensate for ecological functions and the species. And in that, you can have pollinators are not protected. So we're trying to put in place measures that will include this ecological function and take this into consideration. There are a few developers that are starting to think about the idea of creating compensation for pollinators, but for the moment, nothing's been done. And just to highlight this, what you're saying here is this is really as concerns solar farms, land on the ground. When we talk about turbines, there's also a big impact. When we're talking about stopping these, wind turbines, the phase where they're slowing down and the blade is slowing down, it has a really strong impact. When we're talking about flying birds, and there's also an impact as concerns the installation of the wind turbine itself. So we are just trying to apply the law with different measures. We lack a lot of feedback on the efficiency of the compensation measures and the efficiency of all the measures of reduction. We said that the time that research isn't going as quickly as the developers are able to accelerating their deployment of the wind turbine. So there's a gap. And we're really happy that the developers are becoming more and more aware of this impact, but there's still room for improvement. I heard talking about 40 to 50 million for research. I don't see any of that money coming. Our financiers, our funding is the ADEME, and that's it. When you're thinking about 40 to 50 million, I think you're talking about measures of compensation or indirectly. I'm speaking about the money that's invested by the ENR investors in the initial studies for compensation measures. So the studies of biodiversity before, during, and measures measures that are taken after to reduce and compensate. It would be interesting to have a report on that with the benefits. Because 40 to 50 million, when you just say that out loud, I don't know what that represents. Is that 1, 2%? Maybe if you doubled that amount of money, it'd be more interesting for biodiversity. For me, when it concerns research, to make this not a fantasy, at the CNRS, I get 2,000 euros to work every year. 2,000 euros. It's ridiculous. With this, I've got to pay my thesis students, my PhD students, 2,000 euros per year to do my research, to carry out my research. And from the CNRS. So how am I supposed to hire people into PhD studies, go in the field, buy a computer, do conferences? What am I supposed to do? So we currently, in research, we have very few means. It's outside of the ADEME. So when we look at the accelerated deployment of these developers, so the issue is the lack of knowledge for the follow-up on, the lack of means for research to follow up on all of these solutions or these installations. And that's completely right. I would love for every project that there be a small budget for research, even if it's 0.1%, that would be better than nothing. And that's the state of affairs today. So when we're looking at these ENRs that are going so quickly, and we need our research to just go as quickly. When you're talking about research, fundamental research in a research organization, and you're talking about, engineering offices and with renewable energies, with witnesses, with test phases, with feedback experience. This takes time. How can we do this with climate change that's going even faster? We should have anticipated this a long time ago. We should have said, are we stopping everything? No, we've got to seriously put money to build feedback for reconstruction of biodiversity, put in place measures of compensation that be efficient, measures for reduction that are proven. Because right now we're kind of, it's pretty fuzzy. We have some scientific data, and the role of researchers to do what they can to add their argument in order to create favorable measures for conservation of biodiversity. I do have a question I wanted to ask you. If you've identified good practices, are you able to talk about them? Do you think some of them are good among developers? Yes, good practices are, talking with citizens, anticipation, discussing this with protected areas. We know that that's not even taking place. We can cite the example of the National Park of Grand Coast, which I know really well. They created a report on their region, their consumption, their production. They reduced their energetic needs by increasing their production. They also think things up with the local inhabitants, and they made maps for development with identified areas where they'd had the least amount of impact, so to help developers know where they could develop in that area. And their global objective is to produce 100%, 50% of what they consume, which allows this region to say that we're in solidarity with the other territories and regions. If we fill up all of these areas, we'll produce 150% of our the required energy. So in our land, we're autonomous, and we can also help by giving 50% of our production to others. So this was done with the local population. There's a mapping of roofs that they're going to put these PVNs. There's different wind turbine areas where they know they can put them. They've determined the areas for development. And these spaces, and no more. And also what would be good would be bringing the production areas closer to the consumption areas, because where we produce, where there's less social congestion, or just in big cities where we don't see the impact on biodiversity, that's kind of schizophrenic. I understand that in a way, but it also means that renewable energies, in what you say, could not be produced further from cities, and that's where we need it in big cities. And if we take the pluriannual production of renewable energy, the PV farms could be near homes, at the opposite of wind turbines. So we think of parking lots, roofs that are under-equipped, lots of different degraded or abandoned areas, old quarries. I think developers know all this very well. Thank you. Would you like to say a word to that?
Non, je vais prendre beaucoup trop de temps, donc.
No, I take far too long, so.
On parlera de la séquence ERC parce que justement on l'a abordé plusieurs fois.
So we're going to talk about the ERC sequence, but just to come back to a few points for PV farms, solar panels in low-populated areas, that's something we need to exploit. It's something not really well known at ADEME. It's underestimated, and I think a study is being carried out by the ADEME that is in 2019, and you can correct me if these are the right numbers, Thomas, but I think it was about 53 kilowatts that was reduced to, on a potential program, to rapidly transfer to 8 gigawatts.
Quand on regarde les friches qui sont sur le site Cartofriche, les 2/3 font moins d'1 hectare.
Mapping of some of these areas, we can see that 2/3,
0,2 hectares,
0.2 hectares, these are wastelands or wildlands that we cannot where we cannot insert large PV farms. The smaller they are, the more expensive they are. And if we want electricity that's cheap, I know everyone's paying their electric bill today. If we want cheap electricity, that's something we've got to think about.
Évidemment, c'est prioritaire.
A priority. And the question of proximity between production and consumption areas, well, that's like food. Unfortunately, we cannot today produce everything a city needs in terms of their food, and that's the same for energy.
Général comme argument, mais effectivement,
I don't think we have the time to go into but a park in the Grand Coast where they're producing 50% because they're autonomous and in solidarity. But what's also good is to say we're aware that some people cannot be autonomous, and that's why we have to be, linked together. So for the ADEME, can you develop and supportive of each other? How do we reduce and compensate?
Voilà, des exemples de
Do you have examples of good practices?
Ce qui vient d'être dit, vous pouvez.
Comment on what's been said? You can.
Alors, on prendra 5 minutes.
So we'll take 5 minutes for a Q&A between 3 and 3:05, since we started a bit late for some of the technical questions.
So
I'm going to go very quickly when we talk about the ERC sequencing, and you can correct me if I've made a mistake, but the main principle is that, something you all know, the objective of a project is to reach zero loss in biodiversity, and the regulatory framework is this ERC sequence, and I would add S to that, because the question being asked today, we need to also quickly develop these projects, and at the same time, we have to be able to readjust them following that. So the first challenge on all of these projects will be the land projects, is that to avoid locations with huge challenges. So what data is available to us? Where should we not go? And maybe we're not really good at this, and when we're doing our mappings, when we're looking at the challenges, when we're talking about wind turbines, where are the bats? Where are the habitats for these bats? Where are the migrating corridors? What is the vital elements of this particular species? So it's a great challenge for us scientists that need money to work, is to be able to produce this type of map. So we're working with the Natural History Museum, we're working with the CNRS, we're working with the Mediterranean Biodiversity Institute to create these maps. And there will be the same question done for the quality of the soils, and if we're impacting these soils that are really rich in biodiversity, that have a great agricultural potential. So the real challenge today is creating these tools for developers and local authorities so that they can then make suggestions for planning and projects that are coherent. And of course, then there's all the other actions in a secondary time that are really important, is to reduce. Bertrand said that we don't really know how to, but we do have some ideas. We just don't know how to quantify them. But for example, when we're talking about PV panels, we can have an agrivoltaic where we can optimize the light on the ground and precipitation, which would be more interesting than having panels stuck directly to the ground, for example. It's pretty easy to demonstrate. Isn't there a limited height? Isn't there a height with PV solar panels, so we have to reduce this? Yes, that's interesting. this is where science hasn't decided on this. There's some proposals from the INRA. There are some work that's being carried out by Bertrand's team that shows effects depending on the height of the panel and the soil. But we had to make a decree was published. We had to make a decision. So it was 1.10 meters with in height and 2 meters between the panels. But this was based on scientific research that wasn't very very full. And so we need to readjust that if we can. Compensation, for some species, we already know there were other projects, for example, everything for certain types of birds was carried out, and then we're not even talking about wind turbines as well, and then we don't talk about offshore turbines. Developers also have to commit to follow up, to have a long-term follow-up, to understand the effects, the long-term effects. If you look at the implementation of PV solar panels, you can see the effect of the works carried out. So the challenge here is to follow up on what's happening in 5, 10, 20 years in order to be truly able to evaluate and adjust the long-term effects. I just want to add to that. What's about avoiding, it's difficult because we're looking at deploying things and deploying these ENRs so quickly and reducing land surface. So reduction, there's a park, but there's all the legal obligations for fire risk around the park, so there's a lot of impact there. And we've got to be able to understand how we could compensate all the impacts, which currently we don't know. We have to know them, we have to quantify them in a very precise manner. We know that engineering offices try to do it, but they have financial constraints as well, and we lack solutions to compensate all of this. When we talk about reducing the soil quality, how do you improve soil quality on over tens or hundreds of hectares? Well, that's something we don't do at all. And when we talk about follow-up, okay, we're following, but developers have to be able, administratively speaking, to come back on their projects and make the corrections 10 years later. And do they do it? Administratively speaking, for the moment, not so much. And financially, they're not putting much into this.
Pardon, je m'entendais pas. Il y a des met à jour les bridages.
We update and the restrictions of their use.
Particulièrement pour l'éolien, où
for wind turbines, where it's possible to update the restriction time periods.
Pour le photovoltaïque, on a moins.
For PV solar, we've got less of a big picture image of that because they're rather recent, and there wasn't as many rules as for the wind turbines.
Les suivis sont obligatoires.
But the follow-up is obligatory for wind turbines. For PV solars, as soon as the wind farmers, or I'm sorry, the PV farms are a certain size, we've got to follow up on them. These are on public platforms and can be accessed. And also, we've got to understand this, exploit them. All the follow-up is visible. So it's the administration. You were saying there's no administrative obligation. I don't know if 10% of the promised follow-ups have been carried out. For wind turbines, it's obligatory. And what happens if it's not done? It's just obligatory. So if we've created a wind turbine park, it's being controlled by different services, which is a good thing. So the follow-up is being done, it's being published.
Certains sites de REAL sont mal faits pour.
If some sites aren't well done or you're having trouble downloading, then we'll update the engineering office that's currently studying that, because that's an issue, but it's certainly been done and can be consulted. So a large question. So I'm going to leave the floor to the audience. I think that we could have another roundtable on this subject. So if you have questions, we're going to take 5 minutes for questions. There's a woman with a microphone here, so she'll come and hand that to you.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres mains qui se lèvent pour d'autres questions? Si vous voulez peut-être vous présenter.
If you would like to say who you are. Yes, hello, Evelyn de Pass. I work for a bank, the bank Tridos, which is a bank that our social objective is to question sustainability. And yet, we finance a lot of projects for energy, financing for wind turbines, solar, etc. I heard these two gentlemen, rather speaking about biodiversity and its defense, and it's rather worrying when I hear you, because there's such a lack of subsidies and financial aid. I work in a small country, even if we have a lot of projects in France, but I work in Belgium. And to know a lot of the stakeholders, I know that in an informal manner, the Commission has suggested and asked for the State Council, when there's an issue opposing defenders of biodiversity and those who are, for example, in charge of energy transition, wind turbine developers, etc., they ask them in a very informal way to choose and to privilege energy transition to the detriment of biodiversity. Do you consider, gentlemen, at the lack of means that you speak of, there's also a lack of political willpower? And if there's a lack of political willpower, is there a lack of desire for citizens? What can you do, gentlemen? And you who are professionals and experts, what can we do? And what can you do and what can we do as citizens? What can we do further? I'm talking for me personally, but the bank is also interested in all of these projects. And of course, we're also interested in the energy transition. So thank you very much. So I think this is for Mr. Schatz. Lack of political willpower for financing research in biodiversity. So good common sense would allow us to say that we would understand all the impacts in order to compensate them. That's our attitude at the CNPE. We try to put an argument forward that's scientific, that's our opinion, depending on what knowledge we have. And we are not against development of wind turbines. We're for the development of good renewable energy with areas where there's less impact and other the impact is compensated. We want to work hand in hand with developers in order to find solutions. The fact is that there's a huge financial imbalance. I do not think, for me, the means that are available to me for a call for projects are so little as compared to the means that developers have. This imbalance in the social contract, in what's the piece of the pie given to research and the good development of renewable energies, and how quickly the renewable energies are accelerating and the impacts they have. So I'm not saying the developers are not taking this into consideration. I'm saying they don't take it into consideration enough. Thank you. Thank you. One last question, and if someone else has a really important question to ask, well, they can speak to these gentlemen. So the last question is over here. And then there's another round table on hydrogen and renewable hydrogen and mobility. Hello, Marie Béat. I'm a journalist for PIB Magazine France. My question is for you, Mr. Schatz. A few months ago, the OFB fusion created an observatory for renewable energies and biodiversity. They became one structure. I wanted to know how that's impacted research. At that time, I remember that I had discussed this with the director, who was very clear on the fact that it was in order to seek out financial funding. And it was even a question, in her personal opinion, the question of public funding for research. Has this had any impact on your work, its financing, or have you seen any notable trends? So we finally have a resource center where we're able to get information, exchange with other scientists, organize times where we can meet up among researchers, local authorities, and developers. We finally have this space to do that. We finally have this space where we can show our results and our research and capitalize on the work of our researchers. It'd be interesting that all the developers give us their follow-up for the follow-up on biodiversity. That would be very interesting because we finally have a space in which we can exchange. We would like that this observatory be financed as much as the challenge, the challenges, because we would like for it to be long-lasting. And we need an ambitious financing to do so. And why not think of having a very small percentage being given to this observatory for each project carried out? We need permanent employment, and we need to construct a debate around this issue. Thank you so much. I would like to thank all of you for participating, your active participation, and thank you to our 4 speakers for having been present.